as to doing things intentionally. If you do some work and have to give your attention to it, then, even without your noticing it, part of your effort will be connected with keeping attention on what you are doing. But if it becomes quite mechanical, you may be thinking of something else, yet your hands will be still doing it. That will be the mechanical part of the center. If your work needs constant thinking, invention, adaptation, you have to work with intellectual parts. The mechanical part of the intellectual center has a special name. Sometimes it is spoken of as a separate center, and in that case it is called the formatory center or formatory apparatus. Most people use only this part. They never use the better parts of the intellectual center. But ideas of this system or similar ideas cannot be understood by formatory apparatus at all. Formatory apparatus has very definite limitations. One of its peculiarities is that it compares only two things, as though in any particular line only two things existed. Then formatory center likes thinking in extremes. For instance, it either knows everything or it knows nothing. Another of its peculiarities is immediately to look for the opposite. You can find many examples of formatory thinking. For instance, if I say, "You must do this or you must do that," people say, "But you said we cannot do." If I say this needs willpower, they say, "How? If we have no will." If I speak of being more conscious or less conscious, people say, "But we have no consciousness." These are all examples of formatory thinking. Questioner: can you give an example of formatory apparatus rightly used? Ouspensky: if the intellectual center works normally, that is, if other parts do their work, formatory center does its work quite all right. It is a registering apparatus. We are concerned only about its wrong work. This refers not only to the formatory apparatus but to all the mechanical parts of centers. Only when they begin to work wrongly do they become dangerous. So there is no need to worry about their right work. What you must try to do is eliminate their wrong work. The mechanical part of the emotional center wants to do the work of the higher part, and it is the same with the formatory center. It wants to do the work of the intellectual center, and as a result the moving part of the center includes all the intellectual life of an ordinary person. Questioner: how do you account then for people occasionally living in the higher parts of the center? One can occasionally have an idea. Ouspensky: certain combinations of ideas may happen, but we want control, not an explanation of things that happen by themselves. Anything may happen once or twice, but it has no practical value or meaning. Just as once or twice one can find money in the street but one cannot live on it. Questioner: I do not understand what acting mechanically means, because one seems to spend half of one's life doing things mechanically, like writing. Has all this got to be undone? Ouspensky: that is moving center. I do not mean that. Many things are mechanical and should remain mechanical. But mechanical thoughts, mechanical feelings, that is what has to be studied and can and should be changed. Mechanical thinking is not worth a penny. You can think about many things mechanically, but you will get nothing from it. In a mechanical way you can use only a small part of your intellectual center, the formatory apparatus, and it is not worth spending your time on. There is one thing you must understand about parts of centers, and that is that the intellectual parts differ much less from one another than the other parts. This division into intellectual, emotional and moving is very clear and sharply defined in the lower parts of centers, but it becomes much less apparent in the higher parts. Questioner: do only different centers interfere with each other, or can one part of the same center interfere with another part? Ouspensky: it may be anything. Supposing you work with moving center, then instinctive center may interfere, or emotional center, or another part of moving center. Or if you feel in one center and then start speaking, you pass into another center and may even forget what you wanted to say. Questioner: does the sum of the intellectual parts of different centers make up the intellectual center, or are they separate? Ouspensky: no, they can all work separately, but certainly if one could control the intellectual parts of all centers and make them work together, that would be the way to higher centers. Intellectual parts will not make up a center by themselves, but their combined work will produce better work than they can do separately. Questioner: does work on oneself diminish the functions of the mechanical parts of centers? Ouspensky: it will diminish the work of the mechanical parts in the sense that it will diminish mechanicalness where attention and consciousness are useful. The mechanical parts will then do their own work for which they are intended, and perhaps do it better than at present, because now they are too occupied with things that do not concern them. This will enable the better parts of centers to work. Questioner: is mechanicalness to be looked upon as a fact to be observed or as an evil to be fought against? Ouspensky: you see, you will never understand mechanicalness if you speak in this way, in relation to small things, but when you see, or find in your memory, how quite mechanically you can do the most abominable things, which later you cannot understand how you could have done, then you will know what mechanicalness is. All our life we do mechanically what we would never do consciously. That is what we must understand. If we look through our life, year by year, month by month, we see things we would never have done consciously, or things we did not do which we would have done if we were conscious. This is the way to think about mechanicalness. Questioner: is formulation a proper function of the intellectual center? Ouspensky: quite right. There may be different degrees, but at present we can only speak about formulation and formation. In this connection it is important to understand the right meaning of the word formatory. There are two methods of mental conclusions: formation and formulation. Formation is a conclusion arrived at by the way of least resistance, avoiding difficulties. It is easier because it makes itself ready-made phrases, ready-made opinions, like a stamp. It is generally defective with the exception of the simplest cases. Formulation is a conclusion arrived at on the basis of all the available material. It needs effort and is sometimes difficult, but it means the best we can do. Questioner: how is it possible for us to formulate? Will not certain eyes distort the evidence? Ouspensky: if they distort, they will distort the formulation, but certainly it is necessary to learn to distinguish formulation from formation. Formation is, so to speak, just one glance, sometimes quite wrong, and formulation, as I said, is when you collect all you know about a given subject and try to make some deduction from it. Questioner: why is it that sometimes I find lectures interesting and sometimes not? Ouspensky: because you are in different centers. In one center you can be interested, in another center you are not interested. Suppose you are in instinctive center, it cannot be interested in esoteric ideas. It is interested in food and things like that. But if you are in the intellectual or partly in the emotional center, you can be interested. You know that we have 4 rooms in our house, and it depends on which room we're in whether we're interested or not. Questioner: I find in typing routine work one types more quickly. In typing intelligent work one types more slowly. Ouspensky: because 2 centers work. Complicated work needs 2 centers. But even in copying, intellectual center enters. moving center cannot be trusted much. It controls imagination and dreams. So when it works, intellectual center watches. If one works wholly with moving center, one is half asleep. All cooperation of centers is a certain degree of awakeness. What does falling asleep mean? Disconnection of centers. Questioner: speech comes under two centers, doesn't it? Ouspensky: more, even. Generally it is partly instinctive, partly moving, partly intellectual, and it may be emotional, so it may include all four functions. Questioner: is the intellectual part of each separate center the better part, and the one to try and maintain, as against the emotional and mechanical parts of each center? Ouspensky: all parts are equally necessary, but each part must do its own work. Parts are not wrong in themselves, each of them has its own function, but if they replace one another, their work becomes wrong. You see, the idea that we do not use the whole of our brain but only part of it is not a new one, but psychological systems do not explain what we don't use, because parts of centers are not on the same level, they are really different machines. The system gives a real anatomy of our brain and generally of our whole mentality, so this is a very important point. And if one begins to observe oneself from the point of view of attention, one can study the different values of one's mental processes. This is the key to these machines. Questioner: what is the difference between the moving part of the intellectual center and the intellectual part of the moving center? Ouspensky: they are completely different. Intellectual part of moving center can control all our most complicated movements. When we have to invent new movements, suppose one invents a very complicated machine, or works with a very difficult machine, or does very intricate handwork which needs constant attention and constant self-remembering even, in order not to break the whole thing, that would be the work of the intellectual part of moving center. And the moving part of the intellectual center is the registering or formatory apparatus, a card index system in the brain. It is quite useful in its place, but it is used for wrong purposes. Suppose, for instance, that one throws those cards in the air and tries to make deductions from the way they come down. That would be wrong work of the formatory apparatus, and that is what we usually do. Questioner: when you spoke about adjusting things, did you mean trying to make centers work better? What will guide them to this better working? Ouspensky: all work on yourself, self-study, self-knowledge, self-remembering. First we have to know the machine and then we have to learn to control it. We have to readjust functions so that each does its own rightful work. Most of our activity consists of one center doing the work of another center. Our incapacity to reach a normal level lies in our inability to make our centers work rightly. Many inexplicable things we observe are due to wrong work of centers. Questioner: does wrong work of centers mean interference with one another? Ouspensky: there are two forms of wrong work of centers. Either they interfere, that is, one works instead of another, or one takes energy from another. Sometimes centers have to work for each other. If, for some reason, one center stops working, the machine is so arranged that another center can continue its work for a time to avoid an interruption. The original idea of such an arrangement is quite right, but in actual life it has become the cause of mental and physical disturbances, because one center cannot work properly for another, and in the state of identification they like to do wrong work instead of their own work. It has become a kind of bad habit, and by mixing functions the centers begin to mix energies, trying to get more potent energies for which they are not adapted. Questioner: I find it difficult to see instances of wrong work of centers. My only observation is that I often experience a sensation of unnecessary excitement. Ouspensky, you can see examples when people become unnecessarily emotional in relation to things which would be better done without any emotion. Questioner, how can one stop this interference? Ouspensky, our functions are at present conditioned by our state of consciousness. There is a slight variation. We can be a little more conscious than we're, a little more or much less. That affects functions. For if you are more awake, functions produce better results. If you are more asleep, they produce worse results. This we can observe. But as a principle, you must understand that functions and states of consciousness are independent of each other and exist by themselves. The state of consciousness affects functions, and increased consciousness will create new functions. Complete, real awakening will produce new functions which we do not have now. Questioner, the thing to aim at is a perfect adjustment of the four centers? Ouspensky, yes, this is the starting point. After that, a man can think about creating higher states of consciousness, about being conscious of himself, and then about being conscious of things outside himself. This will correspond to the working of higher centers. One center cannot be improved by itself. All must be improved, must come to normal working. You see, the human machine is very cleverly made and everything in it can be used for the same purpose. But on the ordinary level, the work of centers is not fully coordinated. They live too independently, and at the same time they hinder one another and use one another's energy. Every center is adapted to work with a certain kind of energy, and it receives exactly what it needs. But all the centers steal from one another, and so a center that needs a higher kind of energy is reduced to working with a lower kind, or a center suited for working with a less potent energy uses a more potent, more explosive energy. This is how the machine works at present. Imagine several furnaces. One has to work on crude oil, another on wood, a third on petrol. Suppose the one designed for wood is given petrol. We can expect nothing but explosions. And then imagine a furnace designed for petrol and you will see that it cannot work properly on wood or coal. We must distinguish four energies working through us: physical or mechanical energy, for instance, moving this table; life energy, which makes the body absorb food, reconstruct tissues, and so on; psychic or mental energy, with which the centers work; and most important of all, energy of consciousness. Energy of consciousness is not recognized by psychology and by scientific schools. Consciousness is regarded as part of psychic functions. Other schools deny consciousness altogether and regard everything as mechanical. Some schools deny the existence of life energy, but life energy is different from mechanical energy, and living matter can be created only from living matter. All growth proceeds with life energy. Psychic energy is the energy with which centers work. They can work with consciousness or without consciousness, but the results are different, although not so different that the difference can be easily distinguished in others. One can know consciousness only in oneself. For every thought, feeling or action, or for being conscious, we must have corresponding energy. If we have not got it, we go down and work with lower energy, lead merely an animal or vegetable life. Then again we accumulate energy, again have thoughts, can again be conscious for a short time. Even an enormous amount of physical energy cannot produce a thought, for thought are different. A stronger solution is necessary, and consciousness requires a still quicker, more explosive energy. Questioner, if no amount of psychic energy can produce conscious energy, What difference does it make how much psychic energy I use? Ouspensky, you want psychic energy for quite different purposes. For instance, you have to think with psychic energy. Questioner, I have found that trying to keep attention fixed uses a great deal of energy. Does it mean I do it in a wrong way? Ouspensky, no, you have to use energy to keep attention. This is work, and work needs energy. Although on the other hand it saves energy, it saves waste of energy in another direction. If you are doing things without attention, it will mean a much greater loss. Questioner, why is it so difficult to control attention? Ouspensky, lack of habit. We're too accustomed to letting things happen. When we want to control attention or something else, we find it difficult, just as physical work is difficult if we're not accustomed to it. Questioner, why should moments of consciousness be so rare? Is it a question of energy? Ouspensky, no fuel. If you have no electricity, or if you have a pocket torch with a bad battery, you may have a flash and then nothing. Consciousness is light. Light is the result of a certain energy. If there is no energy, there is no light. Questioner, does the secret of all development of consciousness lie in the conservation and control of energy? Ouspensky, no, not all the secret, though conservation and increase of energy is very important, but in itself it is not enough. One has to know how to control it. Energy is the mechanical side of consciousness. We cannot begin with the idea of control. In order to control one small thing, we must know the whole machine. First, we have to stop waste of energy. Second, collect it by self-remembering. Then, adjust things. We cannot begin in any other way. Questioner, can energy be stored? Ouspensky, yes. Energy can be stored when you are able to store it, but at first the question is not about storing but about not wasting. We would have enough energy for everything we want to do if we did not waste it on unnecessary things. For instance, the reason why we are so formatory is that we're too dull. We do not feel enough. We think we feel, but this is an illusion. And the reason why we feel so little is because we have no energy available for the emotional center. Leaks of energy were already spoken about, but the worst of all is expressing negative emotions. If you can stop the expression of negative emotions, you will save energy and never feel the lack of it. We can only hope to become conscious beings if we use in the right way the energy that is now used in the wrong way. The machine can produce enough energy, but you can waste it on being angry or irritated or something like that, and then very little remains. The normal organism produces quite enough energy not only for all centers, but also for storing. Production is all right, but expenditure is wrong. These leaks have to be studied, because with some kinds of leaks it is not worth going on until they're stopped. For the more one accumulates energy, the more will leak out. It would be like pouring water into a sieve. Certain negative emotions produce precisely such leaks. In certain situations, some people go through a whole range of negative emotions so habitual that they do not even notice them. It may occupy only 5 minutes or 5 seconds. But it may be sufficient to spend all the energy their organism produced for 24 hours. I want particularly to draw your attention to this idea of negative emotion and the state of negative emotion. This is really the second important point. The first referred to consciousness, that we're not conscious and that we can become conscious. It is necessary to realize that there is not a single useful negative emotion. Useful in any sense. Negative emotions are all a sign of weakness. Next, we must realize that we can struggle with them. They can be conquered and destroyed, because there is no real center for them. If they had a real center, like instinctive emotions, there would be no chance. We would remain forever in the power of negative emotions. So it is lucky for us that they have no real center. It is an artificial center that works, and this artificial center can be abolished. When this is done, we will feel much better for it. Even the realization that it is possible is very much. But we have many convictions, prejudices and even principles about negative emotions, so it is very difficult to get rid of the idea that they're necessary. Try to think about it, and if you have any questions I will answer them. Questioner: you said we had no positive emotions? Ouspensky: we have no positive emotions. We call positive emotion an emotion that cannot become negative, and all our emotions, even the best we can have in our present state, can become negative at any moment. Also, by their scope, our emotions are too small for positive emotions. Positive emotions include very much, whereas our emotions are very narrow. So at present we have no positive emotions, but negative emotions are there. Questioner: and if we become free of negative emotions? Ouspensky: then we can have positive emotions. Some negative emotions can be simply destroyed, but some others we can dispose of only by transforming them into positive. Only, that is very far from us now. We cannot do it at present. Now we can only prepare the ground for that, chiefly by creating right attitudes, for mental work comes first. We create right mental attitudes by understanding that negative emotions serve no useful purpose and by realizing how much we lose by allowing ourselves the pleasure of having them. Then perhaps we will have enough energy to do something about them. Questioner: to do something about them is to stop them? Ouspensky: we have to begin with right understanding, right attitude. As long as we think negative emotions are unavoidable, or even useful for self-expression, or something like that, we can do nothing. A certain mental struggle is necessary to realize that they have no useful function in our life and that at the same time all life is based on them. There are many strange things in us. First, there are things that could be conscious and are not, and second, we spoil our life by negative emotions for which nature has not even provided a center, so that we must make one artificially. What is mechanical, what is not normal, what is unnatural, is most mechanical. Questioner: can you always tell a negative emotion from a genuine one? Ouspensky: you can tell it by identification. Because two things are always present in negative emotions, identification and negative imagination. Without negative imagination and identification, negative emotions cannot exist. Questioner: when you are in the middle of having a negative emotion such as bad temper, you cannot stop it just by thinking? Ouspensky: no, but you can prepare the ground beforehand. If you can create a right attitude, then after some time it will help you to stop the negative emotion in the beginning. When you are in the middle of it you cannot stop it, then it is too late. You must not let yourself get into a bad temper, you must not justify it. Questioner: from what you say it seems to me you are presupposing an I, higher than others who can do this? Ouspensky: not higher. But some intellectual eyes are free from the emotional center and can see things impartially. They can say I had this negative emotion all my life. Did I get a penny? No. I only paid, and paid and paid. That means it is useless. Questioner: have we emotions that are not negative? Ouspensky: certainly, but not positive. They are not negative yet, but can turn negative the next moment. Questioner: but it seems to me there are circumstances that simply induce one to have negative emotions. Ouspensky, this is one of the worst illusions we have. We think that negative emotions are produced by circumstances, whereas all negative emotions are in us, inside us. This is a very important point. We always think our negative emotions are produced by the fault of other people or by the fault of circumstances. We always think that our negative emotions are in ourselves and are produced by ourselves. There is absolutely not a single unavoidable reason why somebody else's action or some circumstance should produce a negative emotion in me. It is only my weakness. No negative emotion can be produced by external causes if we do not want it. We have negative emotions because we permit them, justify them, explain them by external causes, and in this way we do not struggle with them. Questioner: is there any reason why we are so anxious to keep them? Ouspensky: habit. We're too accustomed to them, and we cannot sleep without them. What would many people do without negative emotions? This habit is so strong that special work is necessary to get rid of them. But in the beginning, work on negative emotions is twofold: studying and trying not to express them. Real work on negative emotions comes later. You cannot study them if you express them. If you try to stop expressing them, then you can see and study them. Questioner: is not changing one's points of view a method of struggling with them? Ouspensky: quite right, only it is not sufficient by itself. Real struggle begins with struggling with identification. If you destroy identification, negative emotions will become weaker by themselves. But of course, change of points of view is also very necessary. Questioner: I understood you to say that struggling with negative emotions is useless, but we must study and observe them. Is this correct? Ouspensky: struggle with negative emotions needs very many efforts. The habit is too strong. At first you must simply study and attempt to struggle with the expression of negative emotions. Now, if you struggle with one emotion, you may create two instead. In time, indirectly, one can gain mastery over emotions, but the first step is study. Questioner: can one have negative emotions and be in good health? Ouspensky: the word health must be taken in a broader sense, from the point of view of the system. We cannot take it in the ordinary sense of physical manifestations, actual absence of physical illness, because one of the first necessities of health is right work of centers. People whose centers work wrongly are not healthy. The idea of health must be enlarged. It cannot be taken narrowly. Questioner: about right work of centers, I do not see how you can prevent emotional center interfering with the work you are trying to do with the intellectual. Ouspensky: it interferes all the time. You can do nothing about it until you have conquered negative emotions and have learned not to identify. When you cease to identify, negative emotions cease to have power, because they work only on the basis of identification. Questioner: when you feel an unpleasant emotion, why is it necessary not to express it? Ouspensky: it is the same as in relation to unnecessary talk. Ask yourself, is it useful? Is it necessary to express them? The idea is to create resistance, otherwise we cannot observe, and this creation of resistance is the introduction to the study of emotions. We cannot see them without it. Questioner: why is it that if you try to resist them it brings about a complete stop of thought? Ouspensky: lack of practice. In the beginning everything stops. Questioner: if you do not express unpleasant emotions, is it good bottling them up? Ouspensky: try. You must not believe anything. If you find that it is good to express them, we will argue. I will then say that you cannot control this expression and that, If you observe, you will find it better not to express them. The question is, can you refrain from expressing them? Much time and many other things besides are necessary in order really not to express unpleasant emotions. Questioner: why is it that it gives a feeling of relief to express anger or irritation? Ouspensky: there is a worm in you that wants to express itself. Then, when it expresses itself you feel relief, but in this way it becomes stronger and has more and more control over you. When you realize that nobody else is responsible for your irritation, little by little you will begin to feel differently. We have much more power over expression of negative emotions than we think, and we can learn not to express them. Even in ordinary life we do not always express negative emotions. In certain conditions we know that it would be dangerous, and if we can control the expression of them in certain conditions, we can control it in all conditions, if we try. Questioner: may not restraint from expressing negative emotions, commonly described as letting off steam, have a harmful effect? Ouspensky: there is no danger. We cannot produce a restraint sufficiently strong to harm ourselves. Letting off steam as a relief is an illusion. It makes us lose energy. Expression of negative emotions is always mechanical, so it can never be useful, but resistance to it is conscious. Questioner: if we must not have negative emotions, this will abolish all emotional life. Ouspensky: quite the opposite. Now we have no emotional life, but only an imitation. The idea is to have an emotional life. Real possibilities of knowing are in the emotional center. Questioner: the same amount of exhaustion is incurred by controlling as by releasing. What then can I gain by trying to control the expression of anger? Ouspensky: it is quite a wrong assumption that it is the same amount of energy, because control increases energy. It may be that you have to expend a certain amount of energy to control some emotion, but next moment, since you do not spend energy on this useless emotion, control will increase your energy. This is the chemical action of control. Questioner: my experience is that suppressing the expression of a negative emotion makes one tired. Ouspensky: you can become tired if you only suppress the expression, but I never said suppress. I said, do not express. Find reasons for not expressing. Suppression can never help, because sooner or later the negative emotion will jump out. If you merely suppress, you keep the identification and only shut off the external expression. It is a question of finding reasons, of thinking rightly, because expression of negative emotion is always based on some kind of wrong thinking. Questioner: I should like to get more help about tackling negative emotions. Ouspensky: it must be your own effort, and first of all you must study your negative emotions and classify them. You must find which negative emotions you chiefly have, why they come, what brings them, and so on. You must understand that your only control over emotions is by mind, but this is not immediate. If you think rightly for 6 months, then it will affect negative emotions. If you begin to think rightly today, it will not change your negative emotions tomorrow. Questioner: when I think about negative emotions, I do understand very clearly that they're in ourselves, and yet, soon after, I continue to express them. Is it simply because I am not one? Ouspensky: first, because you are not one, and second, because you do not try in the right way. It is a question of long work, as I said, and this cannot be changed at once. If one has constant negative emotions, recurring negative emotions of the same kind, one always falls in at the same point. If one observed oneself better, one would know that this was coming, or had come, and if one had thought rightly beforehand, one would have some resistance. But if one has no right attitude, if one does not think rightly, then one is helpless, and the negative emotion happens again at the same time, in the same way. This is one of the methods of controlling emotions through the intellectual center. But attitudes must be created not at the moment of emotional explosion but long beforehand. Then, little by little, emotional explosions will come under the control of the intellect. Thoughts can be more permanent than feelings, and in that way thoughts can influence feelings. You can create permanent thoughts, permanent attitudes which will affect feelings in time. But before this can become possible, a certain discipline must be introduced into our emotions, and a certain knowledge must be acquired in order to work on the emotional mind. Questioner: I have noticed that nearly all the time I hardly feel any emotion or have any vividness of experience. Is this sleep? Ouspensky: partly sleep, partly living in moving and instinctive centers. Then, exactly as you describe, we hardly feel any vividness of experience. Questioner: in some cases a negative emotion of fear seems useful, otherwise people would cross the road at any time without looking. Ouspensky: you speak about instinctive fear. Emotional fear is different. It is based on imagination. Questioner: do negative emotions have a harmful effect on other functions? Ouspensky: you must find that out for yourself. For instance, if you are agitated or irritated, or something like that, notice other things. Can you remember well? Can you think well? Work well? You will see that all your faculties are diminished. This observation will by itself show you many other things to observe. Questioner: why is it that negative emotion appears to affect the functioning of the instinctive center to such a degree? Ouspensky: negative emotion affects all centers. Centers are so connected that you cannot have a strong or violent negative emotion, and with the help of identification they all become strong, without affecting all centers. You cannot have a negative emotion and at the same time do something else right or even think rightly. You eat wrongly, breathe wrongly, walk wrongly, work wrongly, everything. Questioner: are negative emotions a wrong use of the instinctive center? Ouspensky: no, but all emotions have their origin in the instinctive center. In a small child, centers are not divided. Negative emotions are created from material taken from the instinctive center. This material legitimately belongs to the instinctive center and is wrongly borrowed from it. We are in a very strange state, because positive emotions do not belong to our ordinary emotional center but to the higher emotional center, and negative emotions do not belong to the ordinary emotional center but exist in an artificial center. The emotional center borrows material from the instinctive, and with the negative half of the instinctive center and the help of imagination and identification, it creates negative emotions. Destroying them is a very difficult work, but you must realize that as long as negative emotions exist, no development is possible, because development means development of all there is in man. Negative emotions cannot develop. It would be very disastrous if they could. So if one is trying to create consciousness, one must at the same time struggle with negative emotions, for either you keep them or you develop. You cannot have both together. Questioner: would a way to controlling negative emotions be trying to understand why a thing happened, to understand cause and effect? Ouspensky: it may be in some particular case, but at present there is no question of destroying or controlling. The question is of studying. The strongest method for controlling negative emotions is learning not to express them. So we must first struggle with the expression of negative emotions and, Second, with such emotions as we can struggle with, when we learn not to express them, we will speak of the next step. You cannot control negative emotions as long as they have free expression. I want you to understand that stopping the expression of negative emotions and struggle with negative emotions themselves are two quite different practices. Trying to stop the expression comes first. If you express a negative emotion, you are in its power. You can do nothing at that moment. When you have learned not to express it, you can try not to identify, to create a right attitude, and to remember yourself. Questioner: I can sometimes manage not to express a negative emotion to begin with, but it goes on trying to come out. Ouspensky: that means you only stop the external manifestation, and you must try to stop the cause of it. I do not mean the emotion itself, but the cause of the expression. There is a difference. Emotion is one thing, expression is another. Try to find the difference. Questioner: does trying to control unpleasant emotions gradually eliminate them? Ouspensky: certainly, because many of them can exist only when there is no control. The moment control begins, many of them become easy to eliminate. Questioner: if one's early training has been such that it is natural not to express unpleasant emotions, is it not equally mechanical? Ouspensky: this is an academic question. It is necessary to verify whether you can do it in all circumstances. One may be trained not to express negative emotions in certain circumstances, but in other circumstances one will express them. Questioner: is not the point not to feel unpleasant emotions? Ouspensky: that comes later. It is quite a separate question. You come to that by not identifying. Questioner: by what means can one check where one's unpleasant emotions come from, what causes them, and how we are to get over our tendency to deceive ourselves? Is this only possible through a school? Ouspensky: at present it is not important to learn where they come from, but important to stop their expression. Many things about negative emotions can be learned afterwards. As to what causes them, identification is the general cause of all negative emotions. You cannot struggle with them without help. Many people tried. If you realized how small our possibility is, you would understand that one must have every possible help in order to achieve something. Questioner: must negative emotions always be mechanical? Ouspensky: what is opposite to mechanical? Conscious. Who will have negative emotions consciously? When one knows that one can give them up, nobody would have them, so certainly they're mechanical. Questioner: could we hear more about right attitude as a weapon against negative emotions? It must mean more than just not identifying. Ouspensky: certainly, it means more. It means right thinking on a definite subject. For instance, almost all our personal negative emotions are based on accusation. Somebody else is guilty. If, by persistent thinking, we realize that nobody can be guilty against us, that we are the cause of all that happens to us, that changes things, not at once certainly, because many times this realization will come too late, but after some time this right thinking, this creating of right attitude or point of view can become a permanent process. Then negative emotions will only appear occasionally. Exactly by being permanent, this process of right thinking has power over negative emotions. It catches them in the beginning. Questioner: I find that much of my time has passed in a negative state, not very definite, and I don't seem to be able to do anything about it. Ouspensky: yes, but you must have realized that it is generally connected with some kind of identification or imagination. When you find different manifestations of this negative state, You can struggle with it, because this struggle is in the mind. You can refuse some points of view and accept other points of view, and very soon you will see a difference. This is connected with a very big question, because from one point of view we are so mechanical that we can do nothing. But from another point of view there are several things which we can begin to do. We have certain possibilities in us, only we do not use them. It is true that we cannot do anything in the sense that we cannot change what we feel at any given moment, but we can make ourselves think about a subject at a given moment. This is the beginning. We must know what is possible and begin from that, because then the possibility to do something, instead of letting things happen, will gradually increase. We do not realize what enormous power lies in thinking. I do not mean that as a philosophical explanation of power. The power lies in the fact that, if we always think rightly about certain things, we can make it permanent. It grows into a permanent attitude. You may find some inclination to wrong emotional manifestations of some kind. Just at that moment you can do nothing. You have educated in yourself the capacity for this kind of reaction by wrong thinking. But if you start from right thinking, then after some time you will educate in yourself the capacity for a different reaction. Only this method has to be understood, and this understanding must be quite deep. You can apply this method to many different things. This is really the one thing you can do. You can do nothing else. There is no direct way to struggle with negative manifestations because you cannot catch them, and there is no way to prevent them except by being prepared for them beforehand. But a passing realization that they are wrong will not help. It must be very deep. Otherwise you will have an equally difficult process to prepare the ground for another manifestation. You do not realize how much you lose by these spontaneous manifestations of a negative character. They make so many things impossible. Questioner: even if I begin to think rightly, I find imitation starts when I hear somebody grumbling, and I begin to do the same. Ouspensky: the fact that you begin to think rightly will not change anything straight away. It is necessary to think rightly for a long time, then results will come, but not at once. It is a question of months or years to create right attitudes. By creating right attitudes you consolidate the fact that you have really and seriously decided not to give way to negative manifestations. We do not realize how much we lose in this way. We lose exactly what we want to get. But first of all you must stop the habit of expressing negative emotions. This is why, in the very first lectures, when you hear about self-observation, it is explained that you must learn not to express negative emotions. Everybody knows how not to show what they feel. I do not mean in exceptional cases, but in ordinary cases. All negativeness is based on identification, imagination, and on one particular feature, namely, allowing oneself to express it. You always believe you cannot stop it and therefore feel it is quite right to show what you feel. So first you must get rid of this illusion. You can stop the manifestations of negative emotions. If you say I don't want to, I will believe you, but not if you say I cannot. I have given you many suggestions about work on emotions, such as study, struggle with identification, struggle with the expression of negative emotions, right thinking about negative emotions. 4 practices. If you really use all that is given, very soon you will see quite perceptible results. Real control of emotional center needs self-remembering, a new state of consciousness. So it is a long way off. Now we must use auxiliary methods. The most important of them in the beginning is a right attitude. Chapter 4. The study of the methods used in this system by which man can come to a high consciousness begins with the study of a new language. This language is based on different principles which you do not know yet, but as you go on with your study you will very soon begin to understand them. With this language it is possible to come nearer to truth, possible to speak with greater precision than we do now. And two people who understand this language will never misunderstand each other in simple things. You have already heard certain expressions of this language, such as self-remembering, identifying, considering and so on. It is very important to understand the different divisions the system uses, which are part of this language. Man is a very complicated machine and he can be studied in divisions. In ordinary language we do not use these divisions and so people do not understand one another. Try to understand what I'm saying, because it is rather difficult to express. If you take a town, you can understand that it can be divided into north, south, east and west. It can be divided into districts and quarters, and then divided into different streets. It can also be studied from the point of view of its population, for it has people of different nationalities, people of different professions, belonging to different classes and so on. None of these divisions will coincide with one another. Each must be studied separately. You cannot make a general map, including them all. You must make a series of different maps. It is the same with man. For instance, I have already given you certain divisions. The first is the division of centers or functions, so that each man consists of 4 men, each living his own life in the same man, with his own associations, his own likes and dislikes. Then I showed you the division into different ties. This is a very useful division. Man is not one, he is plural, a crowd, consisting of people who do not know one another and who fight with each other. This division into many eyes was supplemented by the different roles a man plays in different circumstances. Then there was the division into knowledge and being, what a man knows and what he is. I have also given you the division of man into 7 categories. Man number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7. Now we come to another, a quite different division, not parallel with any of the others, the division into essence and personality. Essence is what is born in you. Personality is what you acquire. Essence is your own. Personality is not your own. All man's inner life, all his perceptions and reactions are divided into those 2 parts. There are certain things which are born with you, such as certain physical features, state of health, certain kinds of predispositions, inclinations, tendencies and so on. They belong to essence. Personality is what you acquire in the course of your life. Views, opinions, words. It is easier to understand the difference between essence and personality if you find some examples. Although the 2 are always mixed in life, it is easier to distinguish personality and essence in other people than in oneself, because personality changes very often with the change of conditions, but essence remains the same. This division is very important to understand, because many things that we speak about in man refer to essence, while others refer to personality. Questioner: if essence is what we are born with, can it be added to? Can it increase? Ouspensky: yes, but it can be done only if personality becomes educated and ceases to press upon essence. Personality is too heavy, too strong. It surrounds essence like a shell, so nothing can reach it directly. Everything has to pass through personality. Essence cannot grow in these conditions, but if personality becomes more transparent, impressions and external influences will penetrate through it and reach essence, and then essence will begin to grow. Questioner: so a strong personality prevents impressions from reaching one's essence? Ouspensky: yes, but what does a strong personality mean? It means a strong influence of what is not your own, of what you have acquired, other people's words, other people's views and theories. They can form such a thick crust round essence that nothing can penetrate it to reach you, to reach what you are. Questioner: is it possible to break this shell or destroy it? Ouspensky: before destroying this shell of personality, or breaking it, it is necessary to prepare other defenses. If for some reason this shell falls off, people find themselves without any defenses against many very difficult influences which they cannot control. Personality keeps you from certain distant influences. If you weaken it, you will be under many influences which could not reach you before, so you will have even less control than you have now. But there are many things which we could control and do not control now. This is the right way of thinking about it. Questioner: can you give an example of such influences? Ouspensky: for instance, a simple example would be atmospheric changes or the change of seasons. They affect essence very much, and if one is surrounded with personality, one is less affected. Change of seasons is a very serious thing for people whose essence is more open to influences. I give you this simply as an example of things that people do not take into account and about which they have no idea. There are many other things. For instance, old books on magic warn people about how dangerous this is and how one must be prepared beforehand, and in many cases they are right, because the opening up of essence may be good, but it may be accompanied by many dangers. Personality is created on many wrong bases, but it is also a kind of defense. Questioner: is it possible for us to go through life without ever observing essence? Ouspensky: it depends whether it is in school work or not. In ordinary life we do not even know about the existence of those two principles. In self-study one is told of this division, but essence and personality are so mixed that for a long time this division remains theoretical, for it is impossible to say which is which by observation, except in extreme cases. Then, as one works, one gradually begins to see that one thing is more ingrained, goes deeper, another less. In this way, little by little, one can see essence. All permanent or more permanent qualities must depend on essence. When personality is educated and becomes less heavy, many qualities pass into essence and become permanent. This is how essence develops. In personality things jump up and disappear, but what passes into essence remains. Questioner: is essence more or less the same as being? Ouspensky: it cannot be put like that. Being is life. It is a process. Essence is an object. Questioner: is essence in a child more developed than personality? Ouspensky: at a certain very early age essence may be stronger than personality, but they are both undeveloped, and there are different children and different circumstances. Questioner: how can we struggle against personality? Ouspensky: it is not a question of struggle but only of controlling and educating. Personality must not have too much freedom. It must be educated in a certain way, act according to certain principles, work in a certain direction. At present our personality is all wrong. There is too much lying, deceiving oneself, imagination, negative emotions. All these things must be put right. Only then can the machine work as it should. We have to work through personality. For a long time essence can have no practical meaning for us. If we begin to work on it consciously, certain things will influence essence, but not at once. Questioner: Can we do what we want with personality? Ouspensky, if you work, if you study, you will gradually change it, and your work on personality will reflect on essence. Either you control personality, or personality is controlled by thousands of different eyes, each of whom has its own ideas, its own views and desires. We must realize what an enormous work it is to acquire unity when, as we're now, one part decides to work and another part does not know about it or does not agree. When you have educated your personality, when it has become obedient to your aim and begins to serve it, then it is useful and right. But if you have an aim in a certain part of you and your personality works against this aim, then, naturally, it is not right. Questioner: it was said that there is good in personality as well as in essence, but I cannot find anything in it useful for my ultimate aim. Ouspensky: what do you mean when you say there is no good in personality? Even if you observe and find out things about yourself, it is good. This too is in personality. The part that wishes to know, to work, to change is part of personality. There may be many things that are wrong in our personality, and these things have to be studied and eliminated. Personality is developed by study and by diminishing useless functions. Through this it becomes better and cleaner. In school conditions, essence must be more important than personality, and if personality dominates it too much, development becomes impossible, because real development is in essence, and if personality hangs too heavily on it, essence cannot breathe. But personality is also very important. The possibility of change is really very complicated, because it consists of many things. There must be a certain quality in essence, for if this quality does not exist, nothing is possible. There must be certain material, certain acquisitions in personality, and there must be a certain kind of circumstances. Questioner: has personality to allow itself to be second? Does it step back of its own accord? Ouspensky: it does not step back, it becomes different. If it oppresses essence, it is abnormal. In our present state, personality is pathological, unhealthy. With work it simply becomes healthy. Questioner: I do not understand how personality can influence essence if essence is what we are born with. Ouspensky: take the intellectual center. Its contents are not born with as thoughts, ideas, convictions, opinions. These are all acquired. As to how personality can influence essence, suppose in your personality you come to a certain conclusion, and you find yourself by observation to have some essential habit, say, some kind of unpleasant emotion that always comes up in certain circumstances. You realize that it is not useful in any sense. It wastes energy and makes your life more difficult. How can you struggle with it? You find that this negative state feeds on self-justification, that in your ordinary habitual state you always justify it and think it is somebody else's fault, or say that you did not mean it, or that people do not understand you, or something like that. This allows it to exist. If you change your point of view, if you cease justifying it and create instead a permanent idea in yourself that this emotion is wrong, that it is not justifiable, then this point of view may eventually become permanent. Questioner: does heredity count for anything in essence? Ouspensky: heredity practically does not exist in man. Wrong qualities may be hereditary, but good qualities cannot be inherited. Animals are under different laws from man. In them good and bad qualities are equally transmitted. But in man what may be transmitted, apart from physical qualities, are only features of degeneration. Otherwise there is nothing to transmit. Physical features can be inherited, but not features like self-consciousness, Essence cannot be inherited. Questioner, is the tendency to negative emotion in the essence, or is it entirely acquired in personality? Ouspensky, there may be a tendency even in the essence, a certain disposition to it, but we can take it that it all refers to personality, because if there were a really strong tendency to negative emotion in the essence, it would almost mean insanity. Questioner, if there are defects in essence, can they be altered? Ouspensky, yes, but, as I said, personality must change first. Essence does not change so easily. Changing features in essence is very difficult work. It needs knowledge and sufficient energy, and where we can have no knowledge, it is done only when it is necessary, and only with the help of school methods. Suppose one has a lazy essence and one wants to awake. One can change it after a long period of self-study, but one must have help, school help. So it is lucky for us that work on essence comes second, that we have to start with work on personality. But by working on personality we already work to a certain extent on essence. Sleep, awakening, consciousness, all this does not refer to personality, it refers to essence. So actually you work on essence from the very beginning, and personality, by changing, will produce a certain pressure on essence and change it too. Questioner, is one always born with essence? Ouspensky, yes, but often essence remains undeveloped, on the level of a small child. Questioner, is essence the reliable part in us? Ouspensky, even in personality there are reliable and unreliable things. For instance, imagination is unreliable. Imagining that you can swim when you cannot, and knowledge of the multiplication table are both in personality. One is reliable, the other is unreliable. Questioner, does the level of being depend on growth of essence? Ouspensky, certainly, and this is the relation between them. Only you cannot measure being in that way, for the division into essence and personality is at present merely theoretical. But it is useful to remember that these two principles are in you, because, as I said, if you do not know this division it will prevent you from understanding certain other things you will hear. One thing you must realize about essence and personality is that essence is one, whereas personality consists of several groups of I's. So we can say that we have not a personality but personalities in the plural, for there are 5 or 6, sometimes 10 personalities in one person. Magnetic center, for instance, is also in personality, for we are not born with it, it is created in life. It is a group of I's which can, to a certain small extent, control other groups of I's. Some of these personalities are all right, but some will always be in your way and have to be controlled or eliminated. Questioner, what work can one do on personality? Ouspensky, it can be controlled by mind. That is all that can be expected. In your mind you formulate your aim and personality must work in accordance with this aim. Questioner, what is desire to awaken due to? Is it in essence? Ouspensky, this is connected with magnetic center. You will remember that in the first lecture I spoke about magnetic center and the different influences under which man lives. This brings us to the question of why some people are interested in these ideas, while others are not. What creates this desire to know, the energy to seek? Why people who live in similar conditions are so different? For one person is satisfied with ready-made theories and clichés, while another wants to find truth for himself. What is it that explains this difference in people in relation to new ideas? For some people meet with the possibility of acquiring new knowledge and are not interested, while for others it may change the whole trend of their lives. People come to these and similar ideas in different ways. Some understand something, others take them on an ordinary level. The cause of this difference is that man lives in mechanical life under two kinds of influences. What does it mean? It is connected with the idea explained in the beginning, that man is a machine controlled by external influences, by things around him. He may be receptive to one kind of influences and not receptive to another kind. Most of these influences are created in life itself, by people like himself. But among them, mixed with them, there are other influences which are not created in life but come from a different source, from people of a higher mind. They come in the form of religions, science, philosophical systems, esoteric doctrines, art, all sorts of teachings, and so on. They cannot be distinguished from influences of the first kind outwardly, so it depends on the man whether he discriminates between them or not. Man can live only under influences that is, influences of the first kind, and disregard influences B, not be interested in them. But if he is interested in these influences of the second kind and has absorbed them in sufficient quantity, a certain process takes place in him. Results of these influences B, the memory of them, collect separately in a special compartment and form what is called a magnetic center. Magnetic center is a combination of certain interests and emotional associations which makes him turn in a definite direction. It is a certain cycle of ideas and a certain cycle of emotions. This is the origin of interest in this kind of ideas. Questioner: if we are mere machines, are we to conclude that you are trying to lead us, machines, in a certain desirable direction, or are we capable of discriminating between truth and falsity? If so, with what faculty? Ouspensky: with magnetic center. Men are machines, there is no question about that, only they are not quite the same machines as an engine or something of that kind. You have heard already that man can live in 4 states of consciousness, but that in ordinary life he lives only in 2. These 2 other states of consciousness can be developed in man, but they cannot develop by themselves. They have to be developed through knowledge and effort, and the faculty that helps man to understand and discriminate is the magnetic center. Now we are speaking about man before he meets a school. He lives in life under ordinary conditions. Conditions may be very different, but, in any conditions, he lives under the 2 kinds of influence I was speaking about. What are influences? All interests of life, struggle for existence, desires, excitements, possessions, riches, amusements and so on. They are created without intention and are mechanical both in their origin and their action. But at the same time man also lives under influences originally created in schools but thrown into the general turnover of life. These influences are as it were a life apart. They are arranged for a certain purpose, to serve as lights on the way. The rest depends on man himself. All his interests may concentrate only on influences of the first kind, or part of him may remain interested in influences created in life, while another part may be interested in this other kind of influences. If a man notices and studies them, they may accumulate in him. The memory of these interests may begin to collect in him from a very early age and form a certain group of eyes out of the many eyes in him. After some time this group of eyes or magnetic center begins to control and determine his general direction in life and the trend of his interests, or of a part of his interests. Magnetic center means looking for definite things and being on the level of certain things, but if a man does not notice these influences, they will produce no effect. This is why people are so different. One person may be very intellectual, may have studied philosophy, art and so on, and at the same time he has no chance if he has no magnetic center. If he comes in contact with a school, he will not recognize it, and another man may be insufficiently educated, may not have read so much, may not know so many words, yet if he meets a school he may become interested at once. Questioner: what makes us different in this sense? Ouspensky: it is a combination of what we are born with and outside circumstances that makes us what we are. It is all mechanical, all under the law of accident. It is useless to deny that people are born different, but that we cannot change. In any case, in the beginning, we have to take it for granted that people have different capacities, but not for awakening. This is where people make a mistake. Awakening does not depend on what is born. It depends on the magnetic center, and magnetic center depends on what one is interested in. One person is interested in one thing and another thing, but on what it depends we do not know, and it will not help us to investigate this question, because it will only be theories. In our state of consciousness we can only know some things, and we must concentrate on the things we can know without wasting time on the things we cannot know. Questioner: does not our magnetic center depend very largely on mechanical causes? Ouspensky: not quite. As I said, it is a certain combination of interests, and not only interests but also of ideas a man has acquired, a certain knowledge, a certain understanding. It all enters into the magnetic center. It is mechanical like everything else, but influences are different in their nature. Although in the beginning they come mechanically, this is not important. The important point is whether there is interest in influences or not. This is how out of mechanicalness comes struggle with mechanicalness. Magnetic center helps a man to see, understand and distinguish certain things. A man cannot appreciate the difference between ideas. He cannot say which is better and which worse, which suits him, which does not suit him, without the help of magnetic center. Accumulation of knowledge does not help to create a magnetic center. Magnetic center is good taste, with the help of which a man can have a new evaluation of the ideas that come his way. The question is, in this stream of life, to distinguish the two kinds of influences, to feel the difference between them. If a man does not feel it, if he takes influences B in the same way as influences A, then they produce the same effect and magnetic center is not formed. Then, there are many dangers, because some of these ideas which make up the second kind of influences are so distorted that they can form a wrong magnetic center. Magnetic center must be very uniform and very sane to lead somewhere, otherwise it is only an embarrassment and nothing else. Questioner: how does one know whether one is under influences B? Ouspensky: influences B are always there. They come originally from the inner circle of life, from that part of life which has become free from the law of mechanicalness. But they may pass through many stages before they reach man, and may be so distorted and so disguised that it is difficult to recognize them. Just as it is difficult to recognize ideas of an esoteric origin which come to us in the form of legends and myths, or even superstitions and things like that. Sometimes they have an esoteric origin and then they are influences B. Questioner: suppose one only imagines that one is working under influences B? Ouspensky: one does not know about it and one does not work under influences B. One can be interested in influences B just for one's own personal advantage, profession, fame or something like that. Then one loses all the profit one can get from them. But if a man values them for themselves, not selfishly, not only for his own gain, if he is interested in their meaning, then he may get something from them. Definitions are very difficult and mostly wrong. For our ordinary language has so many different associations that sometimes a more precise definition spoils the possibility of understanding. For instance, you can say, though I do not guarantee that it will always be right, that the chief characteristic of influence A is that it is always selfish, whereas influence B is unselfish. But people understand these words so differently that it does not convey much. You can also say that influences A need identification and influences B can exist without identification, and that if there is identification with influences B it spoils them. In fact, the more identification there is with influences B, the more they become influences A. But all this is not sufficient to explain the difference between them. Questioner: is total immersion in influences B and complete rejection of influences A correct attitude to life? Can we altogether dispense with influences A? Ouspensky: why should we? Influences A may be quite legitimate interests in life. If you do not disappear in them, they are quite harmless. One has to accept everything that comes, only not identify. Influences A are not dangerous in themselves, only identification is dangerous. So there is no question of dispensing, there is only the question of having some interest in influences B, of not being entirely under the power of influences A. If people have an interest in these influences B, they have a magnetic center. If not, they have no magnetic center. After some time, with the help of magnetic center, a man may find a school, or if he comes near one he may recognize it, but if he has no magnetic center, he will not notice it, or will not be interested. And if he meets a school or a man who transmits another kind of influence, influence C, magnetic center helps him to recognize this new influence and absorb it. If he has not first absorbed enough influences B, and so has no magnetic center, or if his magnetic center is wrong or too weak, a man will not recognize influence C, or he may meet a wrong school and have wrong instruction, and instead of becoming better become worse. Instead of acquiring, lose. Influence C differs from influences B in that it is conscious, instead of being accidental, both in its origin and its action, whereas influences B are conscious in their origin but accidental or mechanical in their action. Influence C is school influence. Questioner: must one be adult to recognize C influence? Ouspensky: there is no general rule about age. But one must have enough experience, enough temptations from influences A and enough time to accumulate influences B, otherwise influence C will serve as influence B. In other words, it will do the work of a more simple instrument and will not have its full value. When people have tried and have realized that ordinary means do not satisfy them, do not give them what they want, they value influences C, but if they come before that, they take influences C on the same level as the other influences, and influences C lose their power. It is very important to understand that. Questioner: when you recognize influence C, is it bound to be the right one for you? Ouspensky: no, not at all. You may be right or wrong. It depends on your magnetic center. If the magnetic center is right, you are bound to recognize the right things. If it is wrong, you may find quite a wrong school. This happens every day. Why do so many quite unfounded and wrong schools exist, with no material whatever? Because people have a wrong magnetic center. The case is possible, for instance, when a man with a wrongly formed magnetic center may come upon a school which pretends to be connected with esotericism, while in actual fact no such connection exists. In this case, influences which should have been influences of the third kind become influences of the first kind, that is, leading nowhere. Questioner: Isn't there a way in which one can find out? Ouspensky, only by results. But even if people have wrong results, if they have a wrong magnetic center, they persuade themselves that the results are good. One can deceive oneself about anything. Generally speaking, there is very little chance of finding a right school and many possibilities of wrong schools, because a school must have influences that is, ideas that come direct from higher mind. What does direct mean? It means coming not through books, not through ordinary learning accessible to everybody. These ideas must come from another school, and to that school again from another school, and so on, until one comes to the original source. If there are no ideas of that kind, it is only an imitation school. This does not mean that a school must be directly connected with the source, but it must at a certain time have received this kind of ideas, and then people can work on them. But if it has no ideas different from ordinary ideas, it is not a school. Then, at best, it is a school on the level of B influences, that is, a philosophical or scientific school. It can be called a school only if, through it, one may be able to find a direction towards becoming man number 4, although there is no guarantee of attaining it. So, through the school you can find the right direction only if you have a right kind of school. If you come to a wrong kind of school, you lose what you can learn by yourself. Questioner: what becomes of magnetic center when one has come to a school? Ouspensky: we can say that it becomes the part of a man which is interested in schoolwork. It lives on influences B, but now it receives better material, more concentrated knowledge than before. Besides, many things a man has learned before may be useful to him when he has joined a school, particularly after he has thrown away all that is useless. In ordinary life, man does not know what to learn and what to discard. For instance, many things in which people believe have no meaning, but a man often cannot recognize this and takes them all on the same level, both those that have meaning and those that have not. But in studying himself according to school methods, he learns to recognize imaginary values in himself and, through this, to discover imaginary values outside himself. And then, much later, after long work, the group of eyes or the personality which was the magnetic center develops into deputy steward. When the magnetic center is right and a man meets with true influence C, it begins to act on the magnetic center, and then, at this point, man becomes free from the law of accident. The bigger the magnetic center, the more man is free from the law of accident. This means that he becomes free from this law only at the point through which he is connected with influence C. Questioner: you said that, after bringing us into contact with the system, magnetic center becomes deputy steward. Is he the seed of permanent I? Ouspensky: what was magnetic center before you met the work may later become deputy steward, which means a personality that conquers other personalities and leads them, but that does not come at once. Deputy steward is much higher than magnetic center. Magnetic center forms itself from B influences, while deputy steward is formed from one's efforts. Magnetic center is the seed, the germ of deputy steward. Questioner: what is meant by the law of accident? Ouspensky: the life the man-machine, of man who cannot do, who has no will or choice, is controlled by accident, for things in ordinary life happen mechanically, accidentally, there is no reason in them, and just as man's external life is controlled by accidental external influences, so is his inner life also controlled by both internal and external influences which are equally accidental. You will understand that, if you realize what it means that man is asleep, that he cannot do, cannot remember himself, When you think of the constant unconscious flow of thoughts in man, of daydreaming, of identifying and considering, of mental conversations that go on in him, of his constant deviation towards the line of least resistance, people think that accidents are rare, but in actual fact most things that happen to them are accidental. What does accident mean? It means a combination of circumstances which is not dependent on the will of the man himself nor the will of another person, nor on fate, as do, for instance, conditions of birth and upbringing, nor on the preceding actions of the man himself. An accident happens when two lines of events cross one another. Suppose a man stands under the roof of a house, sheltering from rain, and a brick falls and hits him on the head. This would be an accident. There are two separate lines of cause and effect. Take the line of a man's movements and the fact that he happened to stop under the roof of that particular house. Every small thing in it had a cause, but the brick did not enter into this line of cause and effect. Suppose the brick was negligently set and the rain made it loose and at a certain moment it fell. There is nothing in the life of the man or the life of the brick to connect them. The two lines of cause and effect meet accidentally. Questioner: if accidents pull the strings, what makes accidents? Ouspensky: other accidents. Nobody makes accidents. Take it in an ordinary simple way. Things happen in human life according to three laws. 1. The law of accident. When an event happens without any connection with the line of events we observe. 2. The law of fate. Fate refers only to things with which man is born: parents, brothers, sisters, physical capacities, health and things like that. It also refers to birth and death. Sometimes things can happen in our life under the law of fate, and at times they are very important things, but this is very rare. 3. The law of will. Will has two meanings: our own will, or somebody else's will. We cannot speak of our own will, since, as we are, we have none. As regards another person's will, for the purposes of classification, every intentional action of another person may be called the result of this person's will. In studying human life it becomes clear that these definitions are not sufficient. It becomes necessary to introduce between accident and fate a law of cause and effect which controls a certain part of events in man's life. For the difference between events controlled by accident and the strict sense of the word and events resulting from cause and effect becomes abundantly clear. From this point of view we see a considerable difference between people in ordinary life. There are people in whose life the important events are the result of accident, and there are other people in whose case the important events of their life are always the result of their previous actions, that is, depend on cause and effect. Further observation shows that the first type of people, that is people depending on accident, never come near schoolwork, or if they do, they leave very soon, for one accident can bring them and another can just as easily lead them away. Only those people can come to the work whose life is controlled by the law of cause and effect, that is, who have liberated themselves to a considerable extent from the law of accident or who were never entirely under this law. Questioner: you said that man is a machine moved by external influences. Where then does control come in? Ouspensky: there is no control. We must change to have control. Things happen all around us and we are affected by them. At every moment our life is intersected by other lines, so that accident controls most events. The action of one machine affects another machine. We are surrounded by possibilities of accident. If one does not happen, another does. We must understand our situation. In men 1, 2 and 3 there is no control. Practically everything in their life is controlled by accident. There are some things which are the results of their own actions, but they are all on the same level. Control begins on a different level, and it starts with ourselves, control of our reactions, states of consciousness, functions and so on. Then, little by little, we may come to some measure of control in the sense of avoiding one influence and approaching another. It is a very slow process. Questioner: when do we cease to be under the law of accident? Ouspensky: when we develop will. To be completely free from the law of accident is very far, but there are different stages between complete freedom and our present position. In ordinary conditions, accident is opposed to plan. A man who in one or another case acts according to plan escapes in these actions from the law of accident. But actions conforming to plan are impossible in ordinary life except in conditions where the combination of accidental happenings chances to coincide with the plan. The reasons why it is impossible to fulfill a plan in life are, first of all, the absence of unity and constancy in man himself, and the new lines which continually enter man's line of actions and cross it. This can be easily verified if a man tries to follow a plan in anything that does not happen or is opposed to the general trend of momentums operating in his life. For instance, if a man tries to remember himself, to struggle with habits, to observe himself, and so on, he will see that his plan is not being fulfilled and the result is quite different from what he intended. Or that everything stops altogether and even the initial impulse and the understanding of the necessity and usefulness of these attempts vanishes. But if he continues to study himself, to make efforts, to work, he will see that his relation to the law of accident gradually changes. Our being subject to the law of accident is a definite fact that cannot be changed completely. Such as we will always be under a certain possibility of accident, yet little by little we can make accidental happenings less possible. The theory of accidents is very simple. They happen only when the place is empty. If the place is occupied, they cannot happen. Occupied by what? By conscious actions. If you cannot produce a conscious action, at least it must be filled by intentional actions. So when work and everything connected with it becomes in truth the center of gravity of man's life, he becomes practically free from the law of accident. Questioner: what do you call a center of gravity? Ouspensky: the idea of center of gravity can be interpreted in many different ways. It is a more or less permanent aim and the realization of the relative importance of things in connection with this aim. This means that certain interests become more important than anything else. One acquires a permanent direction. One does not go one day in one direction and another day in another. One goes in one direction and one knows the direction. The stronger your center of gravity, the more you are free from accident. When you change your direction every moment, then every moment something new may happen and every accident can turn you one way or another way. But if your intentional activity, such for instance as self-remembering, becomes so definite, so intense and so continual as to leave no place for accidents, accidents will be much less likely to happen, because accidents need space and time. So we have to add more causes which will produce results and in this way simply exclude accident, because the more our time is occupied with conscious work the less room will be left for accidental happenings. Questioner: if one does not identify, if one does not consider, if one does not have negative emotions, will this be creating new causes? Ouspensky: naturally. But since we always identify, always consider and have negative emotions, we cannot experience that. We must see that even to have one negative emotion less would be a new cause. Questioner: how is it possible to live under two such different laws as the law of accident and the law of cause and effect? Ouspensky, I see no contradiction. Cause and effect in relation to the laws under which man lives means result of your own actions. An accident means something happening to you without relation to your action. Questioner, can we direct or mold the law of accident now, or must we wait till we have full consciousness? Ouspensky, there is no question of waiting. If one waits, one never gets anything. At every moment one must do what one can. At the present moment we can to a certain extent mold the law of accident only by molding ourselves. The more control we have of ourselves, the more the law of accident changes and, as I said, later accidents may even practically disappear, although theoretically the possibility will always remain. Questioner, how do we create new causes? Does it mean making plans? Ouspensky, no. You usually make the same plans you have made all your life and expect to have new causes. Questioner, I should like to know how to lessen the effect of accident upon one's work. When I make a plan for the day, it is often spoiled by people coming unexpectedly. Ouspensky, leave such cases alone. What is important is people arise in us coming in and stopping our work. For instance, a negative emotion comes in and stops work. That is what we must prevent. Questioner, accident need not always be a bad accident. It can also be a happy one, can't it? Ouspensky, quite right, but our aim is to get rid of accident, and after some time, if we work, we may become free of both good and bad accidents. Ask yourself whether it will be better. Try to understand how much we expect from good accidents and how difficult life would become if we had to do everything and if nothing happened. Questioner, is one partly free from the law of accident if one is in a school? Ouspensky, no. This would be too simple. Just being there does not change anything. I have just explained that one begins to get out from under the law of accident if one acquires what we call a center of gravity, which means that work on oneself becomes especially important, sufficiently important to occupy a big place in man's life. This creates a certain kind of balance and, little by little, dispenses with accident. Questioner, did you mean that when we are more conscious we are no longer affected by the law of accident? Ouspensky, again, it is not being conscious that does it by itself. When inner accidents stop in us, it will make us more free from external accidents. There are too many accidental things in ourselves and, as I said, we can get rid of these accidental things only by creating a center of gravity, a certain permanent weight in the sense that it keeps us more balanced, and for this we need a school. Questioner, why are you so sure that one cannot develop except through a school? Ouspensky, there are so many difficulties. If you try to understand these difficulties you will see that without method, and without help, one cannot move. One will remain what one is, or rather one will go down, for nothing remains in the same state. If one does not develop, one goes down. In life, in ordinary conditions everything goes down, or one capacity may develop at the expense of another. All capacities cannot develop without the help of school, for system and method are necessary. But before speaking of why schools are necessary it must be realized for whom they are necessary, because schools are not necessary at all for the vast majority of people. They are necessary only to those who already realize the inadequacy of knowledge collected by the ordinary mind and who feel that, by themselves, with their own strength they can neither resolve the problems which surround them nor find the right way. Only such people are capable of overcoming the difficulties connected with schoolwork, and only for them are schools necessary. And in order to understand why schools are necessary, one must realize that the knowledge which comes from men of high mind can be transmitted only to a very limited number of people simultaneously, and that the observance of a whole series of definite conditions, without which knowledge cannot be transmitted correctly, is necessary. The existence of these conditions and the impossibility of doing without them explains the necessity of an organization. The transmission of knowledge demands efforts both on the part of him who receives it and on the part of him who gives it. The organization facilitates these efforts or makes them possible. These conditions cannot come about by themselves. A school can only be organized according to a certain definite plan worked out and known long ago. There can be nothing arbitrary and improvised in schools, but schools can be of different types corresponding to different ways. I shall speak about different ways later. Questioner: can it be explained in what these conditions consist? Ouspensky: these conditions are connected with the necessity of a simultaneous development of knowledge and being. As I said before, the development of one without a corresponding development of the other gives wrong results. Schools are necessary to avoid such one-sided development and the undesirable results connected with it. The conditions of school teaching are such that from the very first steps work progresses simultaneously along two lines, the line of knowledge and the line of being. From the first days at school a man begins to study mechanicalness and to struggle against mechanicalness in himself, against involuntary actions, against unnecessary talk, against imagination, against the expression of negative emotions, against daydreaming and against sleep. In making a step along the line of knowledge a man must make a step along the line of being. The principles of schoolwork, all the demands made upon him, all help him to study his being and to work to change it. Questioner: if there is no hope of attaining a higher degree of consciousness without a school, this would exclude so many who, through no fault of their own, never come into contact with the right school and yet who urgently desire to progress? Ouspensky: it is impossible to account for these things, because man lives to such an extent under the law of accident. An individual man is so small and insignificant. We think we are very important, but in reality we are not important at all. In order to become important we must become something first. For such as we are practically nothing. Who could be interested in our development except ourselves? So actually meeting a school that corresponds to one's type, for one may meet a school that does not correspond to one's type or one's development, is to a great extent a matter of luck. Questioner: would it not be a case of wanting sufficiently? For it is said, "Seek and ye shall find"? Ouspensky: with the exception of very difficult circumstances, when fate, accident and cause and effect are all going against a man, if a man really seeks he can find. He will look for a school with the help of his magnetic center, but if magnetic center is not formed, he cannot start. Questioner: where are the schools leading? Ouspensky: this is an interesting question because it also answers other questions about the differences in men. With the help of a school you can attain what you want, but first you must formulate what you want. A question was asked earlier about whether a school leads machines to what is good for them. If it is a real school, it will not lead machines anywhere, because machines have their own fate in the universe and no one can do anything for them. But the school can help people who are tired of being machines. It can show them a way to cease to be machines and teach them how it can be done. That is all that a school can do, and without a school it cannot be achieved. Questioner: what constitutes a school? Ouspensky: speaking generally, a school is a place where one can learn something. There can be schools of modern languages, schools of music, schools of medicine and so on. But the kind of school I mean is not only for learning but also for becoming different. It was explained before that nobody can work alone, without a school. Also, it must be clear to you by now that a group of people who decide to work by themselves will arrive nowhere, because they would not know where to go and what to do. So we can say that a school is an organization for the transmission to a certain number of prepared people of knowledge coming from higher mind. This is the most essential characteristic of a school. Another very important fact is the selection of students. Only people of a certain preparation and a certain level of understanding are admitted to a real school. A school cannot be open to all. It cannot be open to many. Schools can be of very different levels depending on the preparation and the level of being of the students. The higher the level of the school, the greater the demands made upon the students. So from this point of view, schools are divided into degrees. There are schools where men number 1, 2 and 3 learn how to become number 4 and acquire all the knowledge that will help them in this change. The next degree are schools where men number 4 learn to become number 5. There is no need for us to speak of further degrees, since they are too far from us. But even in schools of the lowest degree, the beginning of schoolwork already means a certain preparation. One cannot pass straight from the absurdity of ordinary life to school. Even if a school does all that is possible to give a man something, if he is not prepared, if he does not know how to take it, it cannot be given. Questioner: what does being prepared mean? Ouspensky: it is first of all necessary to be ready for any level on which one can begin, not only from the point of view of knowledge, but also from the point of view of being. One must realize one's situation, know what one cannot do by oneself, realize that one needs help, and many other things. It depends on what a person needs in a school. Nobody needs a school as such, but if one does need something, then one needs a school in order to get it. Being prepared means that one must already know oneself to a certain extent. One must know one's aim. One must know the value of one's decisions. There must be a certain elimination of lying to oneself. One must be able to be sincere with oneself. Unfortunately, C influence very often becomes B influence if people come to a school unprepared. Later, perhaps after a long time, they may hear the same things that they heard when they first came and discover a new meaning in them. Then this becomes C influence. There are many ideas which, if understood rightly, can become C influence. Besides, one can only enter a school when one has already lost, or is prepared to lose, at least a certain amount of self-will. Self-will is the chief obstacle to entering a school, because a school means not only learning but also discipline, and some people may find discipline boring, or unnecessary. Questioner: is there a form of examination that one must pass before one can enter a school? Ouspensky: examination is almost continuous, it goes on all the time, and not only before one enters a school but also when one is in the school. Questioner: there must be a reason why some people see the possibility of change and others do not. Ouspensky: yes, there are reasons. It is a kind of previous training of the mind. Most people have the same chance, but some accumulate material and are prepared for change, and others not. But even if they are prepared, they need help and have to make efforts. Questioner: can people wish to change and find it impossible? Ouspensky: sometimes resistance is too great. For instance, imagination may be too strong and they may refuse to give it up. Or, as I said, sometimes magnetic center may be formed in a wrong way. There are people with two or more magnetic centers looking in different directions. Then they can never be interested in the same thing for long. But if one has a rightly formed magnetic center, all these interests become connected and it may be a very powerful thing. Questioner: you say that if people are unprepared, C influence becomes B influence for them. Is it because they have nothing to judge it by? Ouspensky: not only because of that, it is because they have no valuation of ideas. They take all ideas on the same level. Questioner: do negative emotions prevent one taking in C influence? Ouspensky: if you have a great deal of negative emotion, it forms a cloud which prevents not only C influence but even A influence getting to you. It has been established long ago that, although C influences exist, one cannot get them by oneself. This means that there is something one has to conquer in order to understand, and in order to understand more one has to conquer something else. This is why school is necessary. In school you cannot deceive yourself, and it can be explained to you why you do not understand. As I said, there are many degrees of schools. Schools that begin on the ordinary level of life are very elementary. In them there are necessarily certain rules and conditions. If one forgets them, or makes excuses for oneself, one cannot really consider oneself as being in a school. Questioner: can one be disciplined to school life without being disciplined to ordinary conventions? Ouspensky: school discipline is based on understanding. It is quite different. Questioner: isn't there a danger of taking discipline as escape from responsibility? Ouspensky: then one will fail. Questioner: to what extent can one develop being without a school? Ouspensky: no real development of being is possible without schools, or rather, it is possible to a certain extent, but it is generally incomplete. Right development of being is impossible without schools, because one cannot look after oneself, one cannot be sufficiently strict with oneself, and it is not only a question of being strict. One simply cannot remember things at the right time. One will forget, or one will make things easy for oneself. If it were possible to work by oneself, schools would be a waste of time and systems would not be necessary. But since they exist, it means that it is impossible without them. One can have no plan, no system by oneself. How can one develop without a plan or system? How can any work be done? How can one get the necessary knowledge, understand one's position, know what to do? One cannot even get preliminary knowledge with which to start. Questioner: do schools necessarily contain people of higher consciousness? Ouspensky: not contain. We cannot expect that. But, as I said, a school cannot be started without knowledge coming from men of a higher mind. Questioner: will a school help me to make decisions that will affect the future? Ouspensky: all that I can say is that what you do today will make tomorrow, so tomorrow depends on what you do today. You can change the future now. That is what must be understood. In ordinary life you cannot change anything. But when you begin to know more, you have more power to change. Schools are not all the same. For some kind of people one kind of school is necessary. For another kind of people there is another kind of school. There is no universal school for all kinds of people. This brings us to the subject of different ways. But before speaking about the ways, it is necessary to realize that thousands of years ago people came to the idea that man can change, that he can acquire something he has not got. What he can acquire was expressed differently and approached from different angles, but the general idea was always the same, that man can develop, that he can acquire something new. So there were formed 3 ways corresponding to the division of man into man number 1, number 2 and number 3. The first way is the way of the fakir. It is a long, difficult and uncertain way. A fakir works on the physical body, on conquering physical pain. The second way is the way of the monk. This way is shorter, more sure and more definite. It requires certain conditions, but above all it requires faith. For if there is no faith, a man cannot be a true monk. The third way is the way of the yogi, the way of knowledge and consciousness. When we speak about the 3 ways, we speak about principles. In actual life they are seldom met with in a pure form, for they are mostly mixed. But if you know the principle, when you study school practices you can separate which practice belongs to which way. When we speak of yogis we really take only Jnana Yoga and Raja Yoga. Jnana Yoga is the yoga of knowledge, of a new way of thinking. It teaches to think in different categories, not in the categories of space and time and of causality. And Raja Yoga is work on being, on consciousness. Although in many respects these ways are very efficient, the characteristic thing about them is that the first step is the most difficult. From the very first moment you have to give up everything and do what you are told. If you keep one little thing, you cannot follow any of these ways. So, although the 3 ways are good in many other respects, they are not sufficiently elastic. For instance, they do not suit our present mode of life. The fakir is an exaggerated number 1 man with a heavy predominance of instinctive moving center. The monk is an exaggerated number 2 man with the emotional center developed and the others underdeveloped. The yogi is an exaggerated number 3 man with the intellectual center developed and the others not sufficiently developed. If only these 3 traditional ways existed, there would be nothing for us, for we're too overeducated for these ways. But there is a 4th way which is a special way, not a combination of the other 3. It is different from others first of all in that there is no external giving up of things. For all the work is inner. A man must begin work in the same conditions in which he finds himself when he meets it, because these conditions are the best for him. If he begins to work and study in these conditions, he can attain something, and later, if it is necessary, he will be able to change them, but not before he sees the necessity for it. So at first one continues to live the same life as before, in the same circumstances as before. In many respects this way proves more difficult than the others, for nothing is harder than to change oneself internally without changing externally. Then in the 4th way the first principle is that man must not believe anything, he must learn. So faith does not enter into the 4th way. One must not believe what one hears or what one is advised. One must find proofs for everything. If one is convinced that something is true, then one can believe it, but not before. This is a brief outline of the difference between the 4 ways. Questioner: why is it wrong to believe? Ouspensky: people believe or disbelieve when they are too lazy to think. You have to choose. You have to be convinced. You are told that you must remember yourself. But it would be wrong for you to remember yourself because you were told. First you must realize that you do not remember yourself and what it means. And then if you really realize that you need it and would like to remember yourself, you will do it in the right way. If you do it simply by copying somebody, you will do it in the wrong way. You must realize that you are doing it for yourself, not because somebody told you. Questioner: is the 4th way for any special type of man? Ouspensky: yes, if you like, for a type of man who cannot follow the other ways. Questioner: does it take much longer? Ouspensky: it can be the shortest of all, because more knowledge enters into it. The 4th way is sometimes called the way of the sly man. The sly man knows about the 3 traditional ways, but he also knows more than they do. Suppose people in all the ways work to get into a certain state necessary for some particular work they have to do. The sly man will produce this state in the shortest time of all, but he must know how to do it. He must know the secret. Questioner: what is the special meaning attached to the word sly man? Ouspensky: what do you understand by slyness? Questioner: indirectness. Ouspensky: yes, many things one cannot get direct. This idea is very largely used in the New Testament, only it is not called being sly. There are situations that are so difficult that one cannot go straight. It is necessary to be sly. Questioner: can anybody go by the fourth way? Ouspensky: no, because it needs understanding and efforts. One must be prepared for making efforts. Questioner: how can anybody tell whether he has got the right way for him? Ouspensky: by results. You meet a system and begin to work. After some time you must be able to say what you have got from it. It is not very difficult. Certainly in most cases it will look at first like intellectual acquisitions, for you acquire new ideas, new knowledge. But it is so arranged that acquiring new ideas in the system is connected with a certain change in understanding, in attention, in will and so on. One cannot get new ideas in a right way without a certain change. Questioner: if the 4 ways are ways towards the same objective, what is the factor, or main quality, common to them all? Ouspensky: what is similar in all the ways is the possibility of changing being. If you think of all that makes up being, such as wrong work of centers, identification, considering, negative emotions, absence of unity and so on, you will understand that all this can be changed in each of the 4 ways. In the way of the fakir by conquering physical suffering, in the way of the monk by creating religious emotion, in the way of the yogi by acquiring knowledge and working on consciousness. Ways are the same, but people are different. A man who can go by one way cannot go by another. There are 4 definite categories of people in our times according to which the ways are divided. I do not mean that it has always been so, but it is definitely so now. This division is connected not so much with people being number 1, 2 or 3 as with there being 1 center people, 2 center people, 3 center people, 4 center people. This means people in whom 1 center is fully developed while the others are underdeveloped, or 2 centers develop and the others not developed, or 3 centers develop and the 4th underdeveloped, or 4 centers develop more or less equally. This makes the division into 4 ways. Questioner: is this system the 4th way? Ouspensky: this is a wrong formulation. You can ask yourself, does this system belong to the way of the fakir, the way of the monk, or the way of the yogi? No, but it may belong to the 4th way. You cannot say this system is the 4th way. The 4th way is very big, and this system is very small by comparison. Questioner: is it only in relation to schools that magnetic center operates? Ouspensky: in the religious way a different magnetic center is necessary. A magnetic center that brings one to a yogi school or a monastery is different from the magnetic center that brings one even to a group that may possibly lead to a 4th way school. With the kind of magnetic center one would not be able to work here. People would not have enough initiative. In the religious way they must obey. In this way people must have broader minds. They must understand. In yogi schools and the religious way one can go on for a long time without understanding, just doing what one is told. Here, results are proportionate to understanding. Questioner: The magnetic center of different people may be attracted by different ideas. Is the starting point connected with that? Ouspensky: yes, it may be very different, but in relation to this system there must be a certain similarity of magnetic centers, so that people can work together, because in a certain period, class and education, people have more or less the same material. Questioner: does the fourth way embrace the three other ways? Ouspensky: no, this is a wrong description, because the fourth way does not have many of the things which enter into the first three ways, and it has many other things that do not enter into the three ways. The idea of the fourth way is that it discards from the three ways all that is unnecessary in them, because besides the necessary things the three ways have other things which have remained there purely through tradition, imitation and so on. In the fourth way all the sides that can develop at the same time, and this makes it different from other ways where you first develop one side and then go back and develop another, then again go back and develop a third side. In the fourth way all the four centers must be more or less alive, on the surface, open to receive impressions, otherwise long preliminary work to open them is necessary before one can begin. Questioner: is not the fourth way actually very much the most difficult, owing to the continual choice entailed under conditions of maximum outside distractions? Ouspensky: it depends what you call most difficult. The other three ways need a very big decision right at the beginning. When you really know nothing, you have to renounce everything absolutely. If you can do that, and if you have other qualities that are needed, you can go by the way of the monk, or the way of the yogi, if you can find a monk or a yogi school. But if you do not know such schools and if you find that you cannot give up even small things, then certainly this is the only way possible for you. It is not a question of more or less difficult, it is a question of which is most possible. Then, if you think, you will find that there is only one way that is possible. Questioner: is there anything in the school of the fourth way equal to prestate, and if so, does it come with self-remembering? Ouspensky: yes, in all the ways one has to pass through the same experiences, only in a different order. Certainly self-remembering, non-identifying and several other practices will give exactly the same personal sensations as high emotions of a religious or an intellectual order. You remember that man was compared to a house with 4 rooms. What does development mean? It means working in the 4 rooms. Only the order of rooms in which a man works is different in different ways. In the fourth way work is done in all the 4 rooms at once. Questioner: is this organization a school? Ouspensky: this is an interesting question. Can we call ourselves a school? To a certain extent we may, because we acquire a certain knowledge and at the same time we learn how to change our being. But I must say in relation to this that in the beginning of our work, in St. Petersburg in 1916, we were made to understand that a school, in the full sense of the term, must consist of 2 degrees, that is, it must have 2 levels in it. One level, where men 1, 2 and 3 learn to become number 4 and the other level where men number 4 learn to become number 5. If a school has 2 levels, it has more possibilities, because a double organization of this kind can give a larger variety of experience and make the work more quick and more sure. So, although in a certain sense we can call ourselves a school, it is better to use this term for a bigger organization. Questioner: did I understand from what you said that this is not exactly a school? Ouspensky: for some people it may be a school, for others not. It is always like that. It cannot be definite and cannot be the same for everybody. Questioner: if it is not yet ready to be called a school, What can make it so? Ouspensky, only work of its members on their own being, understanding of the principles of schoolwork and discipline of a certain very definite kind. If we want to create a school, because we have come to the conclusion that we cannot change by ourselves without it, we must take part in the building of the school. This is the method of the fourth way. In the religious way, schools already exist. But here, if we want a school, we must take part in the building of it. But first you must learn. When you know enough, you will know what to do. Questioner, you said that one can learn how to escape only from those who have escaped before? Ouspensky, quite right, in the allegory of prison. And this means a school can only start from another school. The system can have value only if it comes from higher mind. If we have reason to believe that it only comes from an ordinary mind, like ours, it can have no value and we cannot expect anything from it. Then better sit down and write your own system. Questioner, would it be possible for everyone in a school to progress from number 4 to number 5? Or only for a few? Ouspensky, there is no limitation in principle, but you must understand that there is an enormous difference between man number 4 and man number 5. Man number 4 is a man who has acquired a permanent center of gravity, but in everything else he is an ordinary man. Man number 5 is very different. He already has unity, a permanent I. The third state of consciousness. This means that he is awake. He can always remember himself when he needs it, and the higher emotional center works in him, which gives him many new powers. Questioner, is it worse not to be able to go on with the system than not to have started? Ouspensky, if you have started, nobody can stop you, except yourself. Questioner, how can one reconcile this with what you said about there being no guarantee? Ouspensky, it depends on your work. How can I guarantee your work? What we can get depends on our own efforts, and one must work at one's own risk. But after some time one begins to see, I got this that I did not have before, and I got that I did not have before. So little by little one can be more sure. Questioner, what does a school study? Ouspensky, it studies possibilities of the development of inequalities in man. It begins with the idea that not all the qualities can develop equally. In order that certain qualities should develop, other qualities have to be restrained and some others have to go. Suppose you have 100 qualities. Out of these, suppose 30 can develop and 70 cannot, then you have to restrain those 70 in order that the 30 may develop. And in schools they have a certain knowledge about which qualities can and which cannot develop, which conditions are good, how to restrain certain qualities, how to develop other qualities. Different schools teach in different ways. For instance, this kind of school says simply, develop only consciousness and all the rest will be added unto you, and for that one must struggle with negative emotions, lying, identification, considering, imagination and so on. Questioner, you said we must verify everything, but if we can only know what we ourselves have experienced, does it not limit us to a very small world? Ouspensky, we know not only what we experience ourselves, we know what other people have experienced. The whole idea of school is study on the basis of the experience of other people, not people such as we are, but people of higher mind. Otherwise there can be no school. If a school is limited only to what we know ourselves, then it is not a school. Questioner, isn't it the belief that there exists something beyond what we know that makes us seek for it? Ouspensky, there are many things beyond, only we must understand that our possibility of knowing, actually knowing, is very limited in present conditions. We can formulate problems, We can make theories, but we cannot find answers for them, or we can find merely theoretical answers so that one answer is as good as another. But we can hope and expect that if we change our state of consciousness and perfect our inner machinery, we shall perhaps know more. Questioner: does school stand for self-initiation? Ouspensky: what does self-initiation mean? It is all words. What would it mean to be initiated into the Chinese language? It would mean to learn it, to be taught. You cannot be initiated into Chinese by laying hands on you. Initiation is work. Two people can be in the same school, and for one it will be a school of one level and for another a school of another level, and for a third it may not be a school at all. It depends how deep one is in it. The highest school can be on very low level, and one in the same school can be on different levels, depending on the people in it. It requires work and remembering of aim. Questioner: if schools are so important, why do they not have more influence in the world? Ouspensky: schools can only act through people who are interested in them. They can do nothing if they are surrounded by people who are indifferent. The possibility of schools influencing life is conditioned by the general attitude to schools. In order to have influence, schools must have people who are interested and who would obey, but this must come from below. It cannot be produced by schools. Schools can throw big influences into the world, but if people are not interested in them, they can do nothing. They cannot use violence. Questioner: can a school lose by giving away its knowledge? Ouspensky: a school can lose in many different ways. We shall come to this question later on. It depends whom it gives to. If it gives just in general and does not receive anything, certainly it will lose. If one has money and begins to give it to everybody, whether they deserve it or not, certainly one will lose one's money. Questioner: you said that if we want a school we must take part in building it. How can we do that? Ouspensky: you must remember that the level of a school depends on the level of being of the people who constitute it. If there are not enough people with magnetic center, there can be no school. But it is not simply coming to lectures and accepting what one hears that shows the presence of a magnetic center. Questioner: would the spreading of school ideas and school language among other people be of any help from the point of view of the school? Ouspensky: ideas cannot be spread in the right form. It is important to understand that. It would be very good if it could be done, but it cannot. Words would remain, but the ideas themselves would be different. If it were enough to spread them, why are schools necessary? The language will spread itself, maybe even in our lifetime, but the ideas will enter into the general currency in the wrong form. For instance, there would be no distinction between doing and happening. Questioner: we talk of schools and different levels. Is it not rather confusing? What do high levels mean? Ouspensky: why do you find the idea of high levels confusing? For instance, we can take this idea of levels quite simply in relation to ourselves. Using all our mental capacities we can think only up to a certain level, but if we could use higher centers, for instance higher emotional center which already needs more or less complete self-remembering, then certainly on the same subject we could think quite differently and find many more connections in things which we do not notice now. That shows different levels of thinking, and sometimes we actually have glimpses of a high level of thinking, so we may have some material for observation, because even now we can think differently on the same subject, and as regards different levels of people, we meet with results of work of people obviously belonging to higher planes. We cannot say that our experience of ordinary life is limited to results of work of people like ourselves. Take the New Testament. And there are also works of art, esoteric writings, Christian literature and so on which obviously cannot belong to ordinary people. The existence of people of higher development is not imagination, not a hypothesis, but an actual fact. So I do not understand in what way it is confusing. I do not see how one can think without recognizing this fact. It is a definite fact that people live not only on the level on which we are but can exist on different levels. From this point of view, humanity can be regarded as divided into 4 concentric circles. The 3 inner circles are called esoteric, mesoteric and exoteric. The 4th is the outer circle where men 1, 2 and 3 live. Schools act as gates through which man number 4, who is between the outer and the exoteric circle, can pass. Man number 5 belongs to the exoteric circle, man number 6 to the mesoteric and man number 7 to the esoteric or the innermost circle. The outer circle is also called the circle of the confusion of tongues, for in this circle people cannot understand one another. Understanding is possible only in the inner circles. All this means there are degrees. A man who lives in the outer circle is under the law of accident, or, if he has a strongly expressed essence, his life is more governed by the laws of his type or the laws of fate. But when a man begins to work towards consciousness, he already has direction. This means a change, perhaps not perceptible, but nevertheless cosmically a change. Only individual effort can help man to pass from the outer circle into the exoteric circle. What refers to a man in the outer circle does not refer to a man who begins to work. He is under different laws, or rather, different laws begin to touch a man who begins to work. Each circle is under different laws. Chapter 5. It would be good if, from time to time, you tried to summarize in your mind what you have heard so far, because after some time of coming to lectures and talks one begins to forget the chronology of the ideas, and it is important to remember the order in which they are given. Out of all you have heard, the most important idea is that with certain knowledge and certain efforts man can develop, he can complete himself. The development of man, if it is a process, it is not obligatory at all, passes through certain definite stages or steps. If you return to the beginning, you will remember what was said about the absence of consciousness in man and the fact that when a man realizes it, this realization gives him the possibility of acquiring consciousness, and you will see that this is the direction in which man can develop. As long as he does not realize that he is simply a machine and that all his processes are mechanical, he cannot begin to study himself, for this realization is the beginning of self-study. So study must begin in this way. We must realize that we do not possess self-consciousness, that we cannot be aware of ourselves at moments of action or thought. This is the first step. The second step is to realize that we do not know ourselves. We do not know our machine and how it works. And the next step is to realize that we have to study methods of self-study. We observe ourselves all our life, but we do not know what self-observation means. Real self-observation must be based on facts. So one of the first points is how to remember oneself, how to be more conscious. It is not enough to admit this absence of consciousness in oneself. One has to see it an actual fact, to verify it from personal observation. We do not realize what consciousness is and what it implies. If one becomes conscious for half an hour, it is incredible what one can see and learn. So it is an aim in itself, because of what it brings. And it also means a step towards objective consciousness. It is necessary to speak a little about this, about what is meant by the 4 degrees of consciousness man can possess. If we take it from the point of view of cognition of truth, then in sleep we cannot know the difference between what is true and what is not true. Things we see in dreams all look alike. In the waking state we already have more opportunity to recognize the difference between things. The shape of things is made out by our eye, the surface of things by touch, and, to a certain extent, we can orientate ourselves by the perceptions of our instruments of sense. So there is an objective element, but we ourselves remain subjective to ourselves. When we become self-conscious, we become objective to ourselves, and in objective conscious we can know objective truth about everything. These are the degrees of consciousness. Questioner: must we change our knowledge in order to see things as they really are and know the truth? Ouspensky: no. In this state of consciousness we cannot come to things as they are. We have to change our state of consciousness. But we can take off some layers of lying. Things are surrounded by lying. We can take off 1, 2 or 3 skins and come nearer to real things. Questioner: I am not clear about high consciousness. Could we at least know how to think about it? Ouspensky: we realize the possibility of higher consciousness when we realize that we are not conscious at all. We are conscious only at rare moments, without possibility of control. Now we are in 2 states, in sleep and half awake. Theoretical comparisons of states of consciousness and descriptions in words will not help. But when we begin to awake we realize the state in which we are now. It is necessary to find moments of self-remembering, and then, at these moments, you will see the difference. By studying yourself you will see that you can be very near to sleep, or you can be near to self-consciousness. So study begins with a study of these different states in ourselves. For instance, when we take ourselves as one, or do not think about it, then we are nearly asleep. But when we begin to divide ourselves and know that at every moment it is only one I, or one group of I speaking, then we are nearer to self-consciousness, nearer to objective facts. There are different ways of studying consciousness in oneself. In the beginning the first thing is the realization that one cannot be conscious when one wants to. The best time to realize this is after you have been speaking or doing something. Suppose you have been talking about some important business, or writing a letter, then ask yourself, was I conscious at the time? The second thing, in the beginning, is the realization that you are not one, that you have many different eyes. Questioner: how is one to recognize when one is self-conscious? Ouspensky: you will know, it is quite a different feeling. If you try to be conscious for a moment and then compare it with another moment when you did not try to be conscious, you will see the difference. It cannot be described. One moment you are aware of yourself, another moment you are not. You do things, you speak, you write, and you are not conscious. Only you must remember that it is said from the very beginning that we must study not only states of consciousness but also obstacles to consciousness. So we must study them, and then remove them. All these obstacles are in ourselves. External circumstances we cannot change. We have to take them as they are and change inwardly in these circumstances. Questioner: if you observe yourself for a moment, are you conscious at that moment? Ouspensky: not necessarily. It may be quite mechanical, but if you are conscious at the same time that you observe, the line of your attention will resemble 2 arrows, one showing attention directed on the thing you observe and another on yourself. Questioner: I cannot understand the link between self-observation and self-remembering. How to begin? What to do? Ouspensky: self-remembering is an attempt to be aware of yourself. Self-observation is always directed at some definite function. Either you observe your thoughts, or movements, or emotions, or sensations. It must have a definite object which you observe in yourself. Self-remembering does not divide you. You must remember the whole. It is simply the feeling of I, of your own person. They may come together, particularly at later stages, and then you will be able to do both at the same time, observe something definite, or recognize manifestations in yourself, and remember yourself. But in the beginning the two things are different. You begin with self-observation, that is the normal way, and through self-observation you realize that you do not remember yourself. When you realize that, and that at very rare moments you do remember yourself, then any person who is not definitely prejudiced will be able to understand that it is possible to increase these moments of self-remembering, and then you try to do it. Questioner: I find it difficult to decide whether I really observe myself or only remember things afterwards. Ouspensky: in the beginning there is no particular necessity to worry about which is which. Just do what you can, either observe at the moment, or remember it immediately, or remember after some time, but later you will catch particular moments when you can be aware of yourself at the actual moment when things happen. That will be self-remembering. Questioner: how do you know of the miraculous results which will follow self-remembering? Ouspensky: you see, this is connected with the whole idea of development, with the possibility of changing being. This is one of the first things we must understand, that man is not bound to remain as he is, he can change. There are different degrees of man that can be attained after long and persistent work. If we can be more conscious, this will make higher centers work. The functioning of higher centers will be in many ways miraculous. The idea of self-remembering enters into many systems and school teachings, but it is not in the right place. It is never put first. But this system says that you do not remember yourself, and that if you understand that you do not remember yourself, you may be able to achieve something. Self-awareness is the greatest change possible, because in ordinary conditions of life nobody is aware of himself, and yet people do not realize this. Everybody sitting here, if they ask themselves sincerely whether they are aware of themselves, will have to answer that they're not. Nobody is aware. The whole idea is to be aware of yourself in this place, at this moment. This is the beginning, for one has to begin somewhere. Later it may take different forms, many other things may be included in it. Nothing can describe this. It is material for observation and study. Descriptions will not help. One has to practice. Normally nobody remembers himself. Nobody is aware of himself. This is the ordinary state of a human being, of a man-machine. But if he knows about it, if he realizes it and thinks about it, it becomes possible. Only, in the beginning self-remembering is very slow in coming and very small, with long lapses of not remembering. Questioner: is the essential feature of a state of self-remembering the ordinary state of alertness of mind? Ouspensky: no, you cannot take it like that. It is too small. It is a different state, more different from our present state than our present state is from physical sleep, but even comparing sleep with the ordinary state gives you some possibility of understanding the difference. When you are asleep, your world is limited by actual sensations, but when you wake up and find yourself in the objective world, although you see this world in subjective categories, it is much less limited. But when you realize that this is not full awakening, that you are actually less than half awake, you will understand that if you awake fully you will find yourself in a still richer world and will see and understand many of its characteristics which now pass unnoticed. Questioner: I want to know whether self-remembering, at any rate at an early stage, should be expected to consist of a sterile cessation of attention to anything other than oneself? Ouspensky. At an early stage it can only be a realization that you do not remember yourself. If we realize how little we are aware of ourselves and how tiny the moments are when we are aware, when we remember that and feel that and realize what it means, then we can understand what self-remembering means. If you realize the importance of this fact and all that it implies, it will not be sterile. But if you do not realize it, you are quite right, it will be sterile. Then it will simply be a strange exercise that does not lead anywhere. Questioner. Does self-remembering come automatically when you realize that you do not remember yourself? Ouspensky. This is self-remembering. You cannot make the next step without realizing where you are. It is the same process, the same thing. The more you realize how unpleasant and dangerous it is to be a machine, the more possibility you have to change. Questioner. How? Ouspensky. There is always something we can do at certain moments. You must know these moments, and what to do, and how. We are studying doors. Self-remembering is a door. If realization that we do not remember ourselves becomes continuous, then we can remember ourselves. Every day you can find time to realize that you do not remember yourself. This will gradually bring you to self-remembering. I do not mean to remember that you do not remember yourself but to realize it. I repeat, it is not useful to look for definitions. They would only make understanding more difficult. What is really useful for understanding is comparing the different degrees of consciousness within our ordinary state. For even in our ordinary state of relative consciousness there are different degrees, different levels. We can be nearer to awakening or further from it. We can see such big differences in ourselves. When we really learn to observe, that it will show us the possibilities we have. It is the one unmistakable thing. We are always moving between two shores, between sleep and awakening. Moving more towards one shore or more towards the other creates two different possibilities. One is development, the other is decay. Questioner. You asked us not to accept anything without questioning it. Have you knowledge that these higher states of consciousness have actually been reached? Ouspensky. Oh yes. In the first place you can find many descriptions in literature of how mystics and religious people came to the same things. The similarity of descriptions of these experiences is the best proof. All sorts of people in different countries, thousands of years apart, living in different conditions, have come to the same kind of experience by certain ways. Then you can find many people who have personal experience of this kind, which proves that quite different states of perception and reaction exist. So it is not a hypothesis. Questioner. I have recently had a very strange experience. I was talking to someone and trying to be aware of myself. Suddenly I saw my friend very clearly and realized that before this I had not really seen her at all. Ouspensky. This is a very good observation. It actually happens that way. When you try to be aware of yourself, for a moment you became conscious and saw things you had not seen before. If you could keep this consciousness for, say, 10 minutes, you would see many things which would astonish you. We look with our eyes and do not see, but if we become conscious, we begin to see things about which we have no idea. This is quite normal, if only you do not let imagination enter into it. Questioner. Working to attain consciousness on the lines of the system, does there come a sudden change or illumination? Ouspensky. Sudden? No. What does sudden mean? You see, in the process of growth of unity, when this process has gone on for a long time, at some difficult moment you may feel different. It may look sudden, but it is not really so. It is the result of previous efforts. Questioner: if potentiality for objective consciousness is the normal condition of man, how is it that only a few can develop? Ouspensky: when you try to make the first step towards objective consciousness, which is gaining self-consciousness, and you see how difficult it is and how many forces work in you against it, how many obstacles there are, you will have no doubt that only a few can attain it, that it is a possibility, but a very remote possibility. There are too many obstacles: laziness, lying, inertia. We like to sleep. Questioner: how and why did man come to be this being of false values? Ouspensky: what do you mean by false values? It is a relative concept. From one point of view they may be false, from another true. You can only find out for yourself whether man's development is an abstract idea or the truth. You must yourself come to one or another point of view. If you realize that change is only possible through awakening, then it becomes a fact, because you can see small degrees of awakening in yourself. Questioner: if man does not remember himself, does it mean he has no consciousness? Ouspensky: you do not remember yourself, not man but you. If you try and fail, it does not mean you have no consciousness, but that you have not enough. Your own experience, however limited, can alone show the degree. When we use the word self-consciousness we mean a certain degree, beyond our ordinary amount of consciousness. We have a certain amount of consciousness, but it is not sufficient for getting out of our state. If we had not a drop of consciousness, we would remain as we are. Questioner: how is it possible to recognize self-remembering if we ever do? Ouspensky: first it must be understood by mind what it means and what it would mean to have it, and then it must be understood that one can be at different distances from it. Suppose one is not sure, but the distance between the state of self-remembering and your present state changes, and after a time you realize that one day it is 5,000 miles and another day only 3,000 miles. There is a difference. We cannot speak about several degrees at the same time. We can only speak about the next degree we can produce. Questioner: I want to find out about the next degree. Ouspensky: this is all material for observation. You want to put labels on them, but you cannot. They change all the time. One moment it is almost self-consciousness. The next moment you are asleep. You must observe and see results. In one state you can understand certain things. In the next you cannot. In one state you identify. In another you have control. The more control there is, the nearer you are to self-consciousness. Talk will not help much. It will remain formatory. It is necessary to touch the emotional center, and you can do that only by trying different things. Work is not simple. From the very beginning you must try to do impossible things. Impossible in the sense that they do not happen by themselves.